Quite Meant to Be by Genevieve Cruiser, narrated by Rosalie Fox. Chapter 2. Difficult Questions. Colton. The sun wasn't properly up yet when I quietly closed Roseanne's front door behind me and headed for my truck. She was still fast asleep, and I hadn't bothered to leave a note. I never did. Roseanne and I had an understanding. There would be no strings attached and no romantic gestures. I had had quite enough of that, and if she ever decided that she wanted something more permanent, she was free to find it wherever she could. Roseanne wasn't bad as far as buckle bunnies went. She let me do my own thing and didn't shadow my every move like some others. Our arrangement was made more convenient by the fact that she lived alone, so there were no uncomfortable questions from her parents to deal with. As far as I knew, Roseanne was perfectly happy with the way things stood between us. According to her, love and forever were overrated concepts found only in fairy tales. My parents would have questions, I mused as I started my truck. I had left with Ilana and Mackenzie's dinner and hadn't been back home since. After leaving the Andersons, I had driven around aimlessly, trying to sort through my racing thoughts. I had known Ilana since before we could walk. She had always been a fire-spitting whirlwind, a girl who never backed down from a challenge and took every shot life fired at her head on, getting back up fiercer than ever. Standing in their entrance hall, framed by the porch light, however, she had looked completely overwhelmed for a moment, before her defenses could kick in again. I had wanted to tell her that she didn't have to do this alone, but the words had stuck in my throat. It had been much easier to depart with a grin and a wise-ass comment and leave her fuming. Furious Ilana was familiar. I could handle that. I hadn't the faintest idea what to do when she was vulnerable. Roseanne had provided a perfect distraction. By the time morning came, I had all but forgotten about Ilana and her useless parents. As I drove into the yard, my father poked his head over the edge of the barn's roof and gave me a look that said I'd better be expecting a serious chat with my mother. Dad was a quiet sort who counted his words, a stark contrast to my fiery-tempered mother, who had no trouble with finding words to tell you exactly what you'd done wrong. Consequently, Dad left the scolding to her, only intervening when it appeared tempers were clashing so violently that someone might sustain an injury if he didn't bring reason back into the discussion. Mom was already lugging bales about when I parked. I fell in beside her wordlessly, taking a bale she'd been carrying and scooping up another one for the sake of saving time. "I was worried about you," she finally said, glancing at me over her shoulder as she topped up the mare's water. I had been expecting a tirade, so her quiet statement caught me off guard. She looked tired, and I felt guilty for having made her worry. "I know, I'm sorry." "Were you with Ilana?" "No, I just dropped off their dinner and left." "I was hoping she might talk to you, share something of what she might be feeling." "Ilana's a mystery box without a code, Mama. If she wants to raise her little sister on her own and keep her feelings bottled up, there's nothing any of us can do about it." Mom shrugged, making her way to the next paddock. "Where did you go?" "To Roseanne's." She graced me with a long, level look over her shoulder. Mom had never asked questions when I started staying out overnight and going on a date with a different girl every other day. She wasn't the kind of mother who poked and prodded, but she missed nothing, and I knew she hoped I would tell her what was going on in my life. Sometimes I wished I could. Perhaps I could figure it out for myself, then fix whatever Bernadette had broken when she walked away. But I didn't have the words. Maybe I never would. Mom stopped so suddenly that I nearly crashed into her. She turned to face me, her chin set resolutely. "Should I start knitting?" "What?" I stammered as comprehension dawned. "I need to know whether I should be expecting grandkids." I glanced longingly at Missy's paddock, but Mom clamped a hand onto my shoulder, effectively preventing my escape. She was a tiny woman, barely topping 5 feet. We had all shot past her before we got to middle school. Yet there was something about the way she carried herself that promised she was a force to be reckoned with, hobbit or no. I could simply turn and run, but she'd probably trip me with a piece of baling twine. "I ain't Catholic, Mama." I managed to grin, even though my cheeks were on fire. "You won't be having grandkids anytime soon." She smiled and patted my shoulder. "If I do, I hope they do not come from Roseanne Jennings." And with that, she disappeared back indoors to wake Maddie and make breakfast. As soon as she was gone, I dashed for the tack room and gathered Missy's tack, deciding that I had best escape before my mother decided she'd like to yell at me after all. I admired Missy for a moment before opening her paddock gate. Ribbons and Roses, nicknamed Missy for her sheer attitude, was a honey-colored sorrel Appaloosa mare with a lacy blanket that looked like a dusting of snow across her hindquarters. She was the first Appaloosa foal we had bred, and the reason we had sold all our quarter horses and bought a few more Appaloosa mares and 2 stallions. We had purchased Lilies and Lace, Missy's dam, as something of an experiment, and had her covered by a sorrel stallion from a nearby stud. Missy was the result. When she was still a wobbly-legged foal, I'd walked into their paddock one morning to check on them. She had stopped nursing and looked at me with those huge, soulful eyes that looked as though someone had circled them with eyeliner, walked up to me, nuzzled my hand, and promptly stepped on my foot. I was 11 at the time and had never started a foal from the ground up, but I was in love, and I knew Missy was mine and I was hers. She hadn't been easy to train. Her attitude got in the way more often than not, but the connection was there from the start. Now, 10 years later, I trusted her with my life. She could work cattle in her sleep, dominated every reining competition she had ever entered, and left the quarter horses choking in the dust on a quarter mile. "Let's go do our good deed for the day, Miss Moose. She's a trigger-happy one, though. If she starts shooting, you run as if old Phil with his scruffy excuse for a racehorse is on your tail." She nickered softly as if in understanding, ears pricked. By the time the first rays of sun were peeking over the horizon, Missy's hooves were kicking up gravel and dust, her nose pointed in the direction of the Anderson ranch.